Hi everyone. My name is Lynn and I'm a lawyer with Legal Aid. And at Legal Aid, pardon me, I work within the Refugee Service, which is a small section of Legal Aid that provides legal assistance to people who are here on refugee visas. We don't usually assist people who are in Australia and want to be a refugee, only those people who've come to Australia as a refugee. Okay. The contact details for the Refugee Service are at the end of this presentation, so you can write them all down and then make contact with us. If anything arises today for you that you need to talk about, you want an appointment with us, then that's the way of doing it. Or you can contact somebody at the CMRC and they can put you in contact with us. So what I'm going to talk about today is what's happening with the humanitarian program, that's the refugee program overseas. And then I'm going to talk about citizenship for those people who've been here for a long time, 4 years at least. If you've got questions as I'm going through, then please just stop me. I think raise your hand or somehow let us know that you've got a question, and I'm happy to answer as I go through. You don't need to wait until the end of the session, okay? And also, I guess if there is something that I say that you don't understand, please stop me as well, and I'll go back and explain it. So Gary, can we go to the next slide? If Gary's there. Oh, that's fancy. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is the Offshore humanitarian program, and that's the program where people get refugee visas. And you'll see that on the slide, I've got the numbers that Home Affairs have made available to us. Every year, about 17,000 people will get a refugee or humanitarian visa. So that's been for the last maybe 5 years. That's the number of visas that are available. This year, and it's a financial year, only 11,500 people actually got a visa and entered. 4,000 people are still overseas with permanent resident visas that have been granted to them, but they're not allowed to come in. They haven't been able to enter. I don't know if that applies to any of the Burmese community. We know that it does, many of those 4,000, not all, but many, have been granted to people who are in the Middle East, mostly Syrians and Iraqis. But I think also there are people probably from the Burmese community that have also been granted those visas, but they haven't been able to come in. Well, the reason that they're not allowed to enter, even though they've got a permanent visa, is because you're not considered to be a permanent resident until you actually land in Australia. So a lot of the questions that we're getting is, my relative overseas has been waiting 5 years, 10 years. They've finally got a visa. It was given to them in February this year. Why can't they come? And that's the reason, because you're not considered to be a permanent resident until you actually land in Australia, even if you hold a permanent resident visa. So it's a bit confusing for people. Sometimes the visas that people are granted overseas will expire, and we have asked Home Affairs, well, what will you do with those people if they've been given a visa, but you're not going to let them in because of COVID? And they say that they're going to extend those visas. So if you know anyone who is overseas, who's been given, you know, a refugee or humanitarian visa, so that's one of the 200 visas, 200, 202, 203, 204, 201 is in country. That's they're pretty special. If you've got friends or family who have those visas, they're overseas, but they haven't been able to enter, then they shouldn't worry about that. Eventually they will be able to enter on that visa. The reason that no one's being able to enter at the moment, not just refugees, but anyone generally, is because, of course, the borders have closed. And so only particular people can come into Australia. Next slide, thanks, Gary. There we go. So when might the borders open? We don't know. In short, the answer is we don't know. At the moment, Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, is saying possibly mid-2021, so the middle of next year. And you would have seen in the news what they're saying is we're not going to open the borders until we get a vaccine. So it really all depends on that, when we get a vaccine, as to when people might be able to start re-entering. This applies this applies not only just to refugees and humanitarian entrants. It applies to everybody who wants to come to Australia. You know, students, temporary visa holders, you know, general migrants. It's not just refugees who can't come. It's everyone. There are some people are still able to come to Australia, and I'll go through who those people are now. Next slide, thanks, Gary. Okay, so who can enter Australia now? If you're a citizen or a permanent resident, now I've made a mistake on there, you can come. If you're the husband or wife or the dependent child, and that means a child who's under 18, you can come. If you're a New Zealander, you can come. If you're just going through Australia, so you're landing in Australia and then you're leaving again, you can come. And also people with a compelling and compassionate reason to come. So a lot of my clients are trying to get their relatives in through that exemption. You might, for instance, apply for an exemption to come to Australia if, for instance, there is somebody in Australia who's very unwell and you need someone to come from overseas to see them. Sometimes it might be, for instance, that your relative or your family has been granted a refugee visa. But as I said earlier, because of the ban, they're not allowed to come in. You can still apply for them to come in under this compelling and compassionate reason to travel. That's an application that we can help you with. I think most recently I've seen the statistics and the data around that. I think about 100,000 people have applied to come to Australia under one of these exemptions. About 30,000 people have been allowed to come. So about 1/3 of people who apply are allowed to enter. One other thing to note, if you are thinking about trying to apply for someone to come, and it's not applying to come just on a refugee visa, it could be a visitor visa or a partner visa, then many of the applications get refused the first time, and then you apply and you keep applying and you keep applying, and then all of a sudden you've been granted. So it's good to keep in mind that even if you apply for this exemption and they say no, apply again and just keep applying. It's free, it doesn't cost anything to apply for this exemption to come to Australia. It just depends on how special your reasons are. And again, if that's something that anybody wants to do, you can talk to us about that. Next slide, thanks, Gary. Are you a permanent resident if you hold a permanent resident visa? I covered that earlier. The answer is no. If you haven't come into Australia on your permanent resident visa, then you're not a permanent resident, even if you've got that visa that says you are a permanent resident. If you're overseas and you've got that visa, but you haven't come to Australia yet, then the law says you're not really considered to be a permanent resident. There's nothing much you can do about that, except, of course, you could apply for the exemption that we just talked about. You could go, well, I've got this visa. It was granted to me a while ago. I have a good reason to want to come to Australia. Here's my good reasons. And so you might be allowed to enter Australia on that basis, but you won't be able to come just because you've got a permanent resident visa. Next slide, Gary. Applying to enter Australia, again, I went through this a little bit. Everyone who wants to travel to Australia has to make an application to come, unless you're a permanent resident or a citizen, or you're the husband or wife or a child of a permanent resident or citizen. Everyone has to apply. It's free to apply. The application has to be made online, as with most things these days. You can, if you're looking for where that is, you just go to Home Affairs website and it's pretty prominent. You can see where it says, do you want to travel to Australia? Just click on that button and it'll take you to the page where you can apply for this exemption. Home Affairs say that you should apply, they say at least 1 week before you need to travel to Australia. Most people are saying it's taking 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 weeks to actually get a response. So if there's a good reason for your relatives to come and they want to apply, they should do that as soon as they can, not wait. Another thing is, please don't pay for or organise travel to Australia until you've got that exemption, okay? Otherwise, you will lose your money, because if you're refused, then that's that. If you do get to come into Australia, you will have to go into quarantine, or your relatives will have to go into quarantine. You've probably seen that on the news. It's 2 weeks. For whatever reason you're coming, and from wherever you are coming from, you have to go into quarantine, and you now have to pay for that yourself. It used to be the case that the state government would pay for your 2 weeks of quarantine. It's not the case anymore. People now have to pay. It's $3,000 for the first adult, $1,000 for any other adults in the same family, $500 for each child over the age of 3. So it can be pretty expensive if you've got mum, dad, and 4 kids. That would be for about $6,000 for 2 weeks in quarantine, which you have to pay for. So it sounds like it's a difficult process. It's an expensive process. It absolutely is. And so if you're thinking about an exemption for family members, probably the thing to do, I would say, is maybe speak to us before you make the application, because even if you're successful, and the odds are okay, about 30% of people are getting an exemption, there's a whole bunch of other things that you need to think about, like, can they leave the country that they're in? It's not just about getting to Australia. We know that some countries have some internal borders that are closed. So some people can't actually get out of the country that they're in. Some people can't get flights. Another thing to remember now is, generally Home Affairs will pay for your flights to come to Australia if you're a refugee. They're not doing that at the moment. What they say is, if you can organise your own flight, if we give you an exemption to come in, if we say, yes, you can come, you've got a permanent humanitarian visa, we're not paying for that. You have to organise and pay for your own flights, your own quarantine. So that's another big difference too that applies, that doesn't apply during COVID. Usually if you've got a refugee visa, unless it's a 202, the Home Affairs will pay for you through the IOM. They'll book your flights, they'll pay for them, they'll get your medicals, they'll do everything that you need done, will be done for you and paid. That's not the case now. So you have to remember all of those things. So there's a lot of reasons why people aren't applying to enter, because it's just too expensive. I think we've only had so far one client who's been able to enter, and he was a 13-year-old. So his family's in Australia and he was in Germany for about 2 years without them. And that's the only successful application we've had so far. But again, his parents had to raise some money to get him here. And because he's a minor, he doesn't have to go into quarantine, but there's still lots of costs as well. So that's about who can come to Australia. There's also, sorry, next slide. Sorry, Gary. The next thing is, how do I leave? You know, can I leave? Who can leave Australia now? Yep, we're going to get a next slide, I think, soon. Here it comes. Okay. Gary, you there? Okay. All right, well, I'm going to press on. This is about who can leave Australia now. You have to get permission. There we go. You have to get permission to leave. You can't just leave. Even if you're a citizen or a permanent resident, you can't just get on the plane and leave. You have to get permission to go, just as you have to get permission to come. You have to prove that you've got exceptional circumstances to leave. Most of the applications I've seen are compassionate or humanitarian reasons to travel, which means generally Again, the applications I've seen are, I've got family member overseas who's very unwell, who possibly is going to die. This is going to be my last chance to see them. Those applications have good success rates. So you can apply, again, the process is the same. You apply through Border Force, it's free. You can apply as many times as you like. The thing to remember though is once you leave, you also then have to apply to come back in. It's not one process. It's not that you've applied to leave, and therefore, of course, you'll be allowed to come back in. You won't necessarily be able to come back in. You have to get a flight. You have to go back into quarantine, and there's a limit on the number of people who are allowed to come to Australia every week. Every week, there's only 350 people are allowed to land in New South Wales. So once you go, it's really hard to get back in, because we think there's about, I think they say about 100,000 Australians overseas who want to come in. And because there's a cap, like a limit, 350 people every week to New South Wales, and it's less for other states, it's taking a really long time for people to come back in. So again, that's something else to remember. You can leave, but can you get back in? And you might get stuck overseas. Okay, leaving Australia. That's pretty much all I was going to say about COVID and leaving Australia and getting into Australia. If people have any questions about that, then I'm happy to answer them now. And I think Gary said you can write them in the chat box, or you can just put up your hand and we can go to you. And if I don't hear from anyone, should I just carry on?
I was just asking earlier if your service is free for the refugees?
It's free. Yep, everything is free. Our service is free. Yep, our service is completely free. Sometimes, yeah, if we have to pay for, and this is more relevant to citizenship, which we're speaking about next,
yeah.
If we have to pay for things like medical reports, sometimes we can't pay for those, but our service as lawyers is free. Whatever service we provide, all free.
Thank you.
And even if you're not in Sydney, I should say, we are in Sydney. We're based in Fairfield, our group, our small group. But we're all working from home now at our respective homes, and everything's being done online and on the phone. So even if you're outside of Sydney, and I think some people from outside of Sydney are online now, we can certainly help you, even if you don't live in Sydney. It's usually the issue is getting documents to us, but we can always work out a way to do that. So if you are outside Sydney, please just keep that in mind, that we can help you with the things I've just spoken about.
Yeah.
And also citizenship, which is what I'm going to speak about next. So Gary, can we go to the next slide, please? There we go, citizenship processing. So one of the things that, again, particularly the Burmese community, and I see this in the work that I do, that arises is how long it's taking for applications to be processed. I think in the last 12 months or so, Home Affairs have told us that they have about 100,000 applications on hand. So 100,000 people have made an application to be a citizen, and Home Affairs haven't processed them yet. So that's clearly a problem for people who are waiting. People from refugee backgrounds, their applications generally will be processed. They're not a priority. And the reason for that is this. There are lots of issues around things like identity. That means it takes a lot longer to get through their applications. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Just going back to the numbers, Home Affairs say that they have started interviews again. They stopped them from about March. They stopped, there were no interviews, there were no tests. And in July, they've started those again. So they say there's a backlog. People have been waiting a long time. but we're going to start processing now. So people should see some movement in their applications. They're also doing online citizenship ceremonies rather than, you know, going down to your local council and having a citizenship ceremony, which is the last part of getting citizenship. They're doing online ceremonies, and they say they have been holding about 750 ceremonies a day. So 750 people a day from about July have been having citizenship ceremonies. So that's also clearing a bit of the backlog. And you might find that you're one of the people who's passed the test, had the interview, and you're just waiting for your ceremony. You should see some movement in that area now, because they're really getting up to speed with online ceremonies. Some local councils are doing face-to-face ceremonies, but they're doing those much more slowly. So Home Affairs will contact you if you have passed the test and you've had your interview and you're just waiting for a ceremony. They say that they are gradually contacting everyone who's ready for a ceremony and asking them whether they'd like to do that online. Okay, the next thing I'm going to talk about is, so that's processing. Next slide, Gary, is citizenship problems. As I said earlier, a big issue with the Burmese community is issues around identity, and issues around, to a smaller extent, issues around character, generally relating to driving offences, to be honest. So they're the two things that I'm going to talk about today, and happy again to take some questions if people want to ask me about that stuff. Sorry, next slide, Gary. Identity, big one. So I don't know whether people are having have had their own experience with this, but one issue that keeps coming up regularly for people from Burma is that they haven't been able to give Home Affairs the identity documents that Home Affairs thinks they should have. Now, people think, well, I didn't have those documents when I came to Australia. I didn't have to give those documents to you when I made my application for a refugee visa. You accepted my identity when I came to Australia and gave me an IMI card with my name on it. Why is this a problem now? So what Home Affairs, their view is that citizenship is a much more valuable thing than just getting a permanent resident visa. It's much more serious to give somebody citizenship. And so they want to be absolutely certain that you are the person that you say you are. And in order to prove that you are the person that you say you are, they ask for things like national identity card or household registration, or if you've said somewhere in your application that you went to school, documents from your school, or maybe something from a church that you attended. Now, there's lots of very good reasons why people, particularly people from Burma, are not able to provide those documents. And so what we do with clients who can't provide those documents is we explain in a very detailed statement why they can't provide those documents, what they've done to try and get those documents. So it's not just enough to say, I just can't get them, and this is why. You have to explain what you've done, like I've contacted my family who's still there, or I've contacted the church I used to attend, or I've tried to contact the school, but they have no record, or the school's been destroyed, or whatever, for whatever reason it is that you can't provide the documents. You have to say that in your statement. That's really important, because Home Affairs will say, well, you've told us you can't provide them, but you haven't told us that you tried to get them. So in lots of the decisions where they refuse citizenship, that comes up a lot. So if you can't have any, if you don't have any documents and you simply can't provide them, all you can do is provide a really, really, really detailed statement about who you are, why you can't provide the documents, what you've done to try and get them. Okay. One thing, sorry, next file, please, Gary. Sorry, next slide, sorry. One thing that we often do with, again, in particular our Burmese clients, is we ask them to get a copy of their file from Home Affairs before we start helping them with a statement. And the reason we do that is this. If you say something in your citizenship application about your life, where you grew up, how many brothers and sisters you have, when you left Burma, where you went to school, if you say anything that's even slightly different to what you might have said in your refugee application, Home Affairs will pick up on that and say, different story. You're telling a different story here to the story that you're telling there. Maybe we can't believe you. Maybe that's not your story. Maybe you're making that up because your story is not consistent. Now, there's a lot of reasons why people's stories aren't consistent. It's around their trauma. It's around the fact that they've been outside of their country for a long time. Often it's about the fact that they didn't actually fill in their visa application because they're illiterate. So they don't know actually what was written in their application to come to Australia. They know their life story well enough, but they don't know whether what's written down is the same as actually their life story. So what we have been telling people to do is to get a copy of their file from Home Affairs before they make their application for citizenship. And it's very important that they get the copy of their file before they make their application for citizenship. And this is why it's important. In the last maybe year or so, Home Affairs have been refusing people's citizenship application where they don't have any documents, any identity documents, and where they have made an application for their own file so that they can look at their file and go, okay, this is what was written here. This is what I need to write in my citizenship application. Home Affairs say this about that. If this is really your life story, then you would not need to be reminded of your life story by getting a copy of your file. The fact that you've asked for a copy of your file means that you don't remember your life story, which probably means that you're making it up, which probably means that you're not the person that you say you are. Now, it's an incredibly unfair way of dealing with it, and we've got many clients who are now appealing that decision. But in order to try and avoid that problem, because what generally happens is this, sorry, just go back a step, people put their application for citizenship in, they get a letter back from Home Affairs saying, you haven't given us any documents. Tell us why you haven't given us any documents, and also tell us so that we can try and prove that you are the person you say you are. Tell us what your life story is. So people will come to us as lawyers and say, I've been asked to give my life story. And we'll start asking them questions about, well, what did you write in your application? And they'll often say, I don't know, I didn't complete it. Somebody did it for me. I don't speak English. I don't write, or I didn't then. I don't write or read or speak English then. Somebody did it for me. And so we will say, well, let's get a copy of your file. And so they've made the application for citizenship. We apply for the file. That's when Home Affairs come back to us and say, well, we don't believe you because you should know your story. So it's really important to try and get your file before you make the application for citizenship. And so I think my advice is, if you're thinking about applying for citizenship, if you're close to your 4 years, because you have to be a permanent resident for you have to be a resident for 4 years, get a copy of your file first, okay? And then start thinking about making your application for citizenship, all right? The next slide, Gary, sorry. The next thing I was going to talk about is driving offences, broadly driving offences, but this is really about character. So the things that you have to prove to get citizenship is, I am the person I say I am, identity. And the next is, I'm of good character. I'm a good person. You should give me citizenship because I'm a good person. And one of the things that Home Affairs looks at when they're deciding whether you're a good person is, have you been convicted of any crimes or any offences? Driving offences come up a lot because a lot of people will say to me, well, no, I don't think I've committed any crimes. I mean, I did get a speeding fine once. I've had, I think, you know, a couple of speeding fines, and I've also, once I got pulled over and I was slightly over the legal limit for alcohol. So I had a DUI. DUI is drive whilst intoxicated, or drive under the influence. So, and they're like, but you know, that's kind of minor, right? It is minor, except this. It becomes not very minor if you decide that instead of paying that fine, and sometimes it's a fine and sometimes it's a fine plus you lose points on your license, if you decide that you don't want to pay the fine, or that you think that the fine is too high, or you don't have, you know, you don't have enough money to pay the fine, and you want to appeal that and go to court, then once you go to court, it becomes an offence that you have to declare to citizenship. If you just get the fine and you get the demerit points and you just pay the fine, it's fine, no problem. On the citizenship application form, you don't have to say anything about that. Once you decide that you're going to fight the fine or the offence, you say, no, I wasn't speeding. Hard to fight if, for instance, you've got a speeding camera that says, yeah, you were speeding. Almost impossible to get out of. But some people decide that they're going to go to court anyway, and they're going to have a fight about, you know, how much the fine should be, whether they should be convicted of this offence, whether they should lose those points, whether they should be suspended from driving for a little while. The minute that you go to court and the court says, yes, you've done these things, we're going to say you pay less money for the fine. We won't suspend you for as long as the fine says. So, you know, we won't, the penalty won't be as big, but you're still convicted, because that means you've done that offence. So we have to convict you. We might let you say, okay, well, instead of $300, we'll only make you pay $100. Instead of being suspended from driving for 3 months, we'll say 2 weeks. But once you've done that, that's a conviction, and you have to say that on your citizenship application. And that can sometimes mean, even though they're just minor offences, can sometimes mean that you get refused citizenship because you've got convictions for offences. So again, what we say to people is, you know, if there's a very good reason why you should appeal a fine, a speeding fine, or a fine that you get for some driving offence, and I mean a very good reason is, I didn't do it, it wasn't me driving, or that didn't happen like that, then we always recommend to people that, to be honest, they mostly just pay their fines and not elect to go to court, because it could cause problems with citizenship. I mean, again, I think before you do anything with this, really get advice, because it depends on your circumstances. That's a very general rule. It's very general advice, but it's good for people to know about it, that, hey, I could just pay this, or I can choose to go to court and fight about this. But if you do choose to go to court and fight about it, it becomes something that you have to tell Home Affairs about when you apply for citizenship. Whereas if you don't go to court and just pay it, you don't have to tell them. So it causes no problems with citizenship. So it's just a good idea to get some advice if that's something that's going to happen for you, maybe. Okay, I have got another slide, but I was only going to say one more thing about citizenship generally. I've just talked a lot about the problems, because if there's no problems, then you apply. It takes 12 to 18 months generally to get citizenship, and you're good to go. If you are refused by Home Affairs for one of those reasons, or any other reason, you know, identity, that is, we don't know who you are, or you've been convicted of some offences and they think that you're not of good character for that reason, you can appeal to the AAT. And you've got 28 days to do that from the date that you get the decision, the letter from Home Affairs saying, no, you can't have citizenship. If there is a cost, if you're on Centrelink, it costs $100 to appeal to the AAT, and it takes about 12 months from the time you apply to the AAT till the time you get a decision. So all up, if you've applied for citizenship, you're refused, you go to the AAT, you get a decision, you are looking at a process of about 2 to 3 years. So it's a really long time to wait to get citizenship. So it's really important to get it right the first time, and that's why we encourage people to come to us before they apply, not after they apply and problems come up, because often it's much more difficult to fix the problems once they've come up than to confront them at the very beginning. If you are on a refugee visa, we can help you with applying for citizenship. If you're not on a refugee visa, unfortunately our service can't assist. But again, if that's something that you're thinking about applying, or if you have applied and you think that there might be problems with driving offences or any offences or identity, well worthwhile getting some advice from us. And again, you can just you can contact us. Sorry, next and last slide, I think, Gary. I think that's there we are. So that's the refugee service. So you can call us and make an appointment, or you can send us an email. That's not very clear on your screen. Or you can just ask somebody, either STARTS or CMRC, and they have our contact details and they can make an appointment. The easiest way is emailing, just saying hello. Doesn't have to be fancy. Just give us your name and your phone number and tell us what language you need, and we will just ring you with an interpreter if you need an interpreter to make that booking and then to give you some advice.